Excellences, ladies and gentlemen, and esteemed participants, my name is Carrie Housefun, and I'm a member of POX's Protection of Civilians team, and I will be your moderator for today. On behalf of POX and the Stimson Center, I would like to thank you for joining this WPS Week virtual event on improving gender-sensitive capacities for the protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping training. While we await participants' entry from the waiting room, I will take the prerogative as chair to quickly run through the agenda and some housekeeping rules. In a moment, we will begin with opening remarks from Brian Findley from the Stimson Center, and we're honored to hear from NATO SRSG on Women, Peace and Security, Claire Hutchinson, in a keynote address. Then we will hand it over to 4 expert panelists, followed by a moderated Q&A session. Before I hand things over to our distinguished keynote speaker and panelists, I want to first highlight a few key points about our program for today. You will see some housekeeping notes on the slide for you. Please note that all participants' microphones will be muted throughout the presentations, though we will hopefully invite you to ask questions live during the Q&A portion following the panelists' remarks, at which point it will be possible to turn on microphones and cameras. In the meantime, please feel free to use the chat function to communicate with those of us organizing the session as needed. And you can also submit questions to the panelists using the Q&A function in Zoom at any point during the event. We ask that you include your name. Please keep your questions concise and indicate to whom you would like to direct your questions. Finally, note that the event is being recorded, and both POX and Stimson will provide links to the session on their websites. Thank you for bearing with us. Well, hopefully everyone has joined from the waiting room. So I would like to turn it over at this point to our esteemed partner and co-host, Mr. Brian Findley, the President and CEO of the Stimson Center, who will begin our events with some opening remarks. Brian, to you.
Carrie, thanks so much for that really kind introduction. I'm so grateful to you and to PAX for partnering on this. Excellencies, colleagues, it's really a pleasure to welcome you all to today's virtual side event entitled Improving Gender-Sensitive Capacities for the Protection of Civilians in UN Peacekeeping Training. I'm particularly grateful, as I mentioned, to be able to co-host this side event together with the Government of Rwanda and Carrie, with you and your colleagues at PAX. Like you, I too am really eager to hear from our keynote speaker, Ms. Claire Hutchinson. As everyone I suspect on this in this meeting is aware, Ms. Hutchinson serves as the NATO Secretary General's Special Representative, for Women, Peace and Security. Claire, we're really honored that you could join us here today. I think it's quite clear to everyone that the COVID-19 pandemic has really changed the world for everyone. Unfortunately, however, it has presented, I think, especially acute challenges for civilians living in conflict, as many of our colleagues highlighted on the margins of the 2020 Security Council debate on women, peace and security. Women and children face particular protection challenges, and sadly, it is their plight that often goes overlooked. Now, in 2000, the Security Council adopted the first resolution to explicitly recognize the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women and girls. And that resolution also acknowledged the contributions that women and girls make to conflict prevention, to peacekeeping, to conflict resolution, to peace building. And since then, the UN peacekeeping operations have, of course, also been mandated to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, which is clearly a positive development. Just back in 2018, UN member states committed in the Declaration of Shared Commitments on UN peacekeeping operations to ensuring equal and meaningful participation of women throughout all stages of peacekeeping. And happily, that commitment has been signed by over 150 member states, but barriers to the implementation of the protection of civilians, as well as to women, peace and security mandates, persist clearly. And a better understanding, I think, is clearly needed as to why and how gender-sensitive training can improve the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions. And I think today's event offers a really unique platform to advance some of these calls and really get at some of the underlying issues. If we can strengthen training by incorporating a gender-sensitive analysis, we hope that we can help make peacekeeping missions more effective at protecting civilians. And for our part here at Stimson, I'm really deeply proud of our own Aditi Gore to making some of these visions a reality. I suspect that most of you know that Aditi serves as Senior Fellow and Director of our Protecting Civilians in Conflict program. Now, for those of you that don't know Aditi, I'm eager to meet you because I didn't know there were people like you out there. And if you have a commitment to these issues, I'm really eager to introduce you to Aditi. I'm also confident that we have the right expertise gathered here today with this remarkably distinguished subset of panelists to bring you such a diversity of experience to this discussion, as well as to my colleague Carrie at PAX, who is of course moderating the discussion. I'm very grateful again to you, Carrie. I'd also like to note that we have an extremely diverse audience that is participating, and we really hope to engage you. I know that your experience and questions will enrich the discussion as we tackle this high priority issue together. So on behalf of the organizers, I really would like to thank you all for your contributions to this important discussion. I'm grateful to you all for tuning in. I look forward to the discussion. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Carrie.
Thank you, Brian, for that great introduction to our session today. And with that, I would actually like to hand things directly over to our keynote speaker, Ms. Claire Hutchinson. As the high-level focal point on all aspects of NATO's contribution to the WPS agenda, she's responsible for facilitating coordination and consistency across the institution's policies and activities. This includes the NATO Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council Policy and Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which is rooted in a framework of 3 principles: integration, inclusiveness, and integrity. Previously serving as a senior gender advisor with the United Nations, she provided critical strategic guidance to the UN Department of Peacekeeping on the WPS agenda in New York, Kosovo, and Lebanon. Claire, we're truly honored to have you with us here today. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Carrie. I'm actually thrilled to be here. As just mentioned, I spent 15 wonderful years in the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, at the time DPKO, where I honed my skills on women, peace, and security, and got to know the protection of civilians mandate, which is a little different here in NATO, as I will talk about, but it is absolutely my true pleasure to be here. And especially on the cusp of this anniversary, 1325, as you know, was a watershed moment because the first time, as Brian mentioned, the Security Council recognized women's experiences and roles in conflict as a matter of international peace and security. And then since then, the adoption of the other resolutions is important because it's widened the scope and breadth of gendered peace and security. And the adoption of 1325 presaged a new global thinking about peace and security, and what is now understood as standard normative practice in addressing conflict. It was in the 90s a revolutionary approach to conceptualization of peace and security. So at its essence, 1325 is about making the invisible visible, the foundation building on the integrated and interconnected themes of empowerment and protection, which gives more clarity to these mutually reinforcing ideas. And it was adopted in part and builds on the previous resolutions on protection of civilians and children on conflict as a way to address the inadequacies of protection for women and girls by acknowledging the gendered norms needed that to be addressed and reframed in the context of protection and security. So I'll speak from NATO's point of view that over the years, we have elevated our commitments, and they're the same commitments as with peacekeeping, the commitments to protection of civilians and women, peace and security by developing robust policies and guidelines. And as a result, we have seen progress, including a positive trajectory in the number of areas like gender balance. And we recognize that diversity makes us stronger and better prepared to deal with the challenges we face. And that's including increasing the numbers of women deployed as soldiers, as officers, as also, but importantly, at decision making. We acknowledge that women have an indispensable role to play in the ever-changing nature of conflict because it demands a broader engagement with populations, and strategies do require more gender diversity. And at NATO, we have increased the numbers of women. We have more women in our NATO allies as defense ministers. We had a defense ministerial last week. And we are hearing women's voices more than ever in the construct of defense and security. However, I don't believe that we should base the efficacy of women, peace and security on gender parity alone. It should not be a surrogate for gender equality. To genuinely advance women, peace and security, we must be vigilant in promoting the integration of gender perspectives into all our functions to enable the participation of women and to enhance their protection. And we need to hear women because they are better placed to tell us about their protection. As a human majority, women have the potential to change the world and to shape the future. And the evolution of the Women, Peace and Security mandate must therefore be a part of stabilization and the future of protection mandates. For NATO, this has meant that we've taken a human security approach. It provides a new way of thinking about the range of challenges the world faces and how to respond to them. And central to this is understanding that security should encompass a broad conceptualization of what constitutes security and what promotes the link to peace. It is the interconnected tissue between cross-cutting areas, and for NATO, that means between cultural property protection, children armed conflict, human trafficking, protection of civilians, and conflict-related sexual violence. And all of these together that will allow all people to live free from abuse and violence, we hope. And to apply this effectively, we must recognize, therefore, that different populations require different protection mechanisms. And that is where women, peace and security comes into play, because addressing the protection of women and girls is essential. They have different needs and different requirements. And in particular, we have seen this in the long-term destructive nature of conflict-related sexual violence and seen its grave effect on entire communities. And we know, unfortunately, and we've seen, this continues to pose a threat to global peace and security. Because even though we have COVID, it has not diminished the rise of violence against women and their bodies. And over the years, the Protection of Civilians mandate has interlinked with women, peace and security through increased expectation that actors, and including NATO military personnel who are operating in conflict and post-conflict settings, are mandated to protect civilians, that they must take a more prominent role in addressing this issue. Combating sexual violence and conflict and focusing on operationally effective responses to this appalling abuse of women and girls and men and boys is critical. It is a tactic of war. It is used as rape to destroy communities, to intimidate and terrorize. And for NATO, we have taken this up by over the next few months, we'll start beginning negotiating on our conflict-related sexual violence policy to address this. Sexual violence stems, as you all know, from fundamental gender inequalities. So focusing on solely protective and preventative solutions is limited and insufficient. To effectively address sexual violence, we must address and dismantle all the obstacles that impede women's full participation in peace and security. And by doing so, then help them protect themselves better. And this also includes protection from sexual exploitation abuse. Equal treatment, dignity, and respect should be imperatives, both in war, but also in peacetime. And that is why we've also endorsed our very first sexual exploitation abuse policy, preventing and responding to. And we are advancing our zero tolerance approach. But as Brian said, COVID has changed the world. It's changed NATO, it's changed peacekeeping, it's changed us all. And it's changed the way we think about security. It's impressed upon us the importance of remaining vigilant and being prepared and engaged in the face of new security challenges. And also, through this, how do we protect our people, be it outside or inside our nations? So as we start this third decade of women, peace and security and the agenda, and in the midst of a pandemic, which is testing all of our abilities to react to a security crisis, which is also a gendered security crisis, we recognize that the security needs of women and men are different, and that protection work must adequately reflect a whole of population approach. In NATO, we're committed to guaranteeing that all our tasks are infused with gender and gender perspectives are weaved through our work, because I do believe there cannot be protection without participation. For NATO, integrating gender is a matter of credibility and capability, a matter of institutional excellence and operational effectiveness. And gender equality, in the end, is not optional, it is fundamental. And it allows us to recognize, understand, and respond to all of the complex and changing security challenges that we face. The vision of security must be anchored to the inclusion of women in all activities, including in training, including in education and capabilities and capacity building. To generally advance gender equality over these next 10, 20, however long years it takes, we've got to be vigilant with our principles in both empowerment as well as in protection. We have to be progressive, but we have to be accountable. Because it's only when gender and the reflection on the equality of women and men becomes an integral part of our thinking that we will do a change the way we do our business. So in closing, I just want to say a big happy birthday to Resolution 1325. And I want to thank Pax and Stimson for the invitation, and thank you for listening. I'm really looking forward to hearing the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for setting the stage for us, Ms. Hutchinson, and for so adeptly, I would say, outlining both the progress and the challenges before us today. I am now pleased to hand over the floor to our distinguished panel of experts. I will introduce each of our speakers one at a time, and they will have approximately 10 minutes to present their remarks. We will then follow with hopefully about 30 minutes for discussion with all of our panelists. Just a reminder to our participants, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function during the presentations. We will begin with Lieutenant Commander Marcia Andrade Braga. A member of the Brazilian Navy, Lieutenant Commander Braga is the 2019 recipient of the UN Military Gender Advocate of the Year Award, which recognizes the dedication and effort of individual peacekeepers in promoting the principles of Resolution 1325. Serving as the military gender advisor at MINUSCA headquarters since April 2018, Lieutenant Commander Braga helped to build a network of trained gender advisors and focal points among the mission's military units, and promoted mixed teams of men and women to conduct community-based patrols around the country to improve understanding of local protection needs. Lieutenant Commander Braga is also a driving force behind MINUSCA's engagement with local women leaders, making sure that the voices of women are heard throughout the ongoing peace process. It's a pleasure to have you join us today, Lieutenant Commander, and we welcome your remarks.
First of all, good morning, and I'd like to say thank you for this opportunity and to talk a little bit about my developed job in MINUSCA. I was deployed on 23rd April 2018, and I worked as Force Headquarters Military Gender and Protection Advisor until 1st May 2019. When I arrived in Central African Republic, I found a very difficult situation. A high number of protection incidents, mainly against women and children. And I was the third one in that position, and there were no focal points or a military gender personnel and protection personnel to work in different levels. So I started preparing a plan with a focus on protection of civilians, prevention violations, using gender perspective. In this way, I used the MINUSCA mandate and Resolution 1325, which was the base of my developed job. So I prepared this action plan, and my idea was to improve situational awareness, to really understand how the conflict was affecting men, women, boys, and girls, to understand this difference, to understand and to use this knowledge in the military planning. So in this way, I started preparing my team. So I requested military gender and protection personnel for the operational and tactical level. So sector headquarters, it was very important to have a protection advisor in order to advise the commander, the sector commander, but the same way, to conduct it, to ensure that gender perspective, that you had gender perspective in peacekeeping operations, and in the same way in tactical level. So I started to receive this personnel to sectors, and at the same way to provide the training. Training was one of the most important part of my action plan. So it was very important to explain how to employ, how to use this gender perspective in peacekeeping operations. It was very important to really understand how to use this gender during the protection activity, the force protection activities. So when I visited each area, I started, my first activity was present my action plan to the sector commander and to explain my idea concerning gender perspective in peacekeeping operations, to explain the importance of this gender and protection personnel in field, because it was something new, it was a new position, and it was important to show the roles that was expected to be developed, and at the same time to show the importance of the position. And during my trainings, it was more or less 2 hours training, I started explaining the gender dynamic in area. So to explain the importance to understand the roles, the routine of each group, men, women, boys, and girls, and to observe the vulnerabilities, the threats facing each group. Because sometimes I observed that protection of civilians was like a homogeneous group. So it was not gender sensitive, understanding the difference, and because we have difference, considering the areas and the different groups, and so it was very important to start explaining gender and this gender dynamic is contextualized in each area, because I visited each area in Central African Republic, each sector, and starting on child protection and protection of civilians at all. So when I was explaining protection of civilians and the case of military, which was very important, the tier 2 physical protection, it was very important to present the question that must be answered, like who is at risk, where they are moving, where are they? And in this way, I was giving some examples. For example, when I was in some areas, it was very clear that I had women and children all the time crossing the roads. So in this moment, they were very vulnerable to threats in field. And mainly when I had, for example, if I had a movement restriction because of the presence of armed groups, they need to continue because they didn't have another choice. So it was something that I started to show how to observe these vulnerabilities and use all this knowledge in the military planning. Because actually we can't stay all the time in all the parts. We have a limited number of resources of military, so it's important to target the sensitive areas and the particular threats and how the armed groups were acting and the kind of human rights that were being violated and this kind of training. And the second part was, if I have this question, how to answer, how to gather this information. And it was showing the importance of engagement, the importance of building trust, the importance of the mix, the patrols, and mainly areas that I had a high number of conflict-related sexual violence against women and the children. So it was one part of my training, and my training was more or less 2 hours because it was very important to have the presence of commanders, of chiefs, the chief operations, intelligence. It was very important to involve the leadership It was, I think, a strength in my job, because I really received the support from the chiefs. And with all this training, I started the practice. So a second part of my training was during my patrols, and when we could observe a joint patrol, these vulnerabilities, and to observe, for example, during the night patrol. It was very difficult to have a completely dark environment, and only with the lights of the car that you could see something. And even in this scenario, it was possible to observe children and women crossing the road. So it was a moment that they were very vulnerable, but at the same time, it was something very difficult to identify aggressor, because it was very difficult to see something. So it was one part, and in these patrols, I was all the time with the focal point. That was the one that was expected to continue with this kind of training, and to ensure this gender and protection mainstreaming in force in the tactical level and operational levels. So it was a very important part. And another part of this training was concerning the engagement with local women leaders, women organizations. So it was a moment that I was there, and I really could understand the conflict, listen from the women there, how the conflict was affecting the local the activities and the local communities. So it was a job that was not alone, of course, and all the time I was showing the importance to work with mission components, because another part of this training that is important to highlight is concerning reporting, because we had a serious problem concerning information sharing. So it was very important to know how to report the kind of information that was important to the job, to the military planning, and the kind of information that was important to receive. Information that could support decision, that could prevent violation, for example, changes in the routine. Because sometimes they needed to change the road that they were using because some presence of armed groups, or because a bridge that was destroyed. And this kind of information was very important for us to prevent violations. Because if you didn't have this kind of information, it was difficult to stay in another part. I had a problem like this in Bria, where we have the biggest IDP camp in Central African Republic that lost 9 women in 1 week. And trying to understand what happened, we discovered that they changed the track that they were using to assess their farm. So it was an information that was very important to stay present and to prevent the violations. So it was a way to do this job. This training was very important. Of course, that it's a shared responsibility. TCCs in pre-deployment training, induction training, and ongoing training that you were developing this kind of awareness. It was very important to improve situational awareness and really to understand the different protection needs of each group. So in this way, to finalize my presentation, I'd like to say that it was a way to be more effective, preventing violation, protecting civilians. It's not something so clear for military, so it's important to use, I used to say, the soldier's language, a very simple language, and to show with examples and in field how to do the job. Because sometimes we have very good documents, but they are not effective, but that you are not implementing them. So thanks so much for this opportunity, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Commander Braga. for providing some examples indeed of what gender sensitive training looks like in the field and practice from your experience, and for identifying the benefits of doing so for both peacekeepers and communities. So thank you. I would now like to introduce Ms. Ruth Bolin Aluak, a Gender Affairs Officer at the UN Department of Peace Operations. Ms. Aluak has previously worked on special assignments with the Secretariat of the East African Community, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, Conflict Early Warning and Response Mechanism, the Regional Center of Small Arms and Light Weapons, and the International Conference on the Great Lakes region, in addition to the United Nations. Ms. Aluak, I'm very happy to hand the floor over to you, please.
Thank you very much. First, I would want to just appreciate the organizers for giving me the privilege to share my insights and reflections on the subject at hand. And probably I want to state it very categorical. I'll be sharing experience based on my 5-year stint at the International Peace and Security Training Center, because it is the space within which I interacted with peacekeepers from different missions, from the African region and from NATO. And also it's one of the spaces where I had an opportunity of conducting trainings in mission and outside the missions, and was able to just share points on a couple of things in the whole subject. At the time, I was working as a directing staff responsible for training and partial research. And from time to time, I was also involved in monitoring and evaluating progress. When I went into the institution, I was going in as a peace and security expert, but not so much as a gender expert. But the only difference is that there was a consciousness on gender, and good enough, it also coincided with the time at which the global study on 1325 and the Hippo report had been released. And it is during this time that most peacekeeping schools had been tasked to look at the whole subject of having gender strictly in their processes. So in terms of this conversation, was the first question I had to respond to was how the inclusion of gender sensitive approaches, why is it important in training? And one of the things I just want to highlight as a point of departure is that when you look at the POC mandate, it is a responsibility of all the mission components, and also a responsibility that touches the different functions. So it means when we look at gender sensitivities, it is linked to missions, and it is also linked to their functions. When you look at the language of mandates, at least most of them, it touches to the use of all necessary means to prevent and to respond any forms of threat that can be met on civilian. And all this often will operate in the context of an armed conflict. So when we start to look, move next, please. When we start to see the significance of gender sensitive training, especially in the broader context of peacekeeping operations, one of the things we realize is that when most contingents are deployed, there is an assumption that they are already aware of gender, that they are already aware of armed conflict, that they're already aware and conversant with everything, which from experience, we realize that so many contingents would be deployed without any information, without any proper briefing, other than their knowledge on hard security. And so the significance of gender training was quite important because it created an opportunity for one to have a common understanding on what armed conflict is, its overall implication on gender, and as our Commander Marcia said, it is implication on gender in the context of diversity, men, women, boys, and girls, but then you go beyond gender across races and ethnic groups, because when you look at groups, for instance, in South Sudan, in Somalia, in DRC, the gender aspect plays very differently. And then you dig deeper to have a common understanding on the issue of victimhood, and also the issue of vulnerability, and also the issue of protection, because these three aspects have very different bearing on men, women, boys, and girls in all these spaces. Another critical thing that was important for us, especially in training, was that that sensitivity had to be backed by statistical evidence, numbers, who are the men, who are the women, how many are they, within which age groups, because then that would inform a lot of decisions that the different commanders would make. It would also inform the kind of resources that are going to be directed towards the different interventions. It will inform their planning. Even as we talk of patrols, as we talk of restructuring some of the institutions to create an enabling environment, it meant that all these things had to be backed by some gender sensitive data, which means then at the level of training, that was going to be very important. Another critical thing which we found interesting and we emphasized on was the whole conceptualization of gender. In my experience to date, when you deal with contingents, most of them have the notion gender is synonymous to women and women are homogeneous. So we had to have a clear understanding, what is gender, what is women, why are we focusing on women? And then WPS would come to mind under 1325. What do we mean by gender sensitivity? What is gender responsivity? How is integration and how does it apply in the work of a peacekeeper in terms of executing the mandate? Another fourth issue was the whole issue of gender awareness and sensitization, which is a huge, I always say it's the elephant in the box, because peacekeepers are just men and women like you and I, coming into that space with deep biases, informed by their own cultures. They never have a space. So it is the training platform operated as a space of creating that awareness to them, creating the consciousness, such that they would see how their own personal inhibitions could actually hinder their implementation of this particular, of integrating and creating, of conducting their work within the whole framework. Let's move to the next. So it then followed that as we start integrating and creating sensitivity, we also got to discover by way of assessment that when they are deployed, you know your rules of engagement and probably you know what is expected of you. So there was that disconnect between the strategy, the operation, and the tactical when it comes to POC, protection mandate. And you see, when you look at the protection mandate, there is the common framing, use of all necessary means, including force, to protect the civilian. So at the strategic level, what does it mean? And it was very important for us then in training, in terms of gender sensitivity, to just help the peacekeepers to understand the Security Council language. And ordinarily, most often in reviewing that language, you are looking at gender responsivity. You want to see such language. You want to see the language of gender integration. You want to see a language of gender inclusion. You want to see a language in the Security Council that actually breaks men, women, boys, girls, children in that broader context. Then you look, they have to understand, how does the mandate fit with the existing policy frameworks that actually reinforce gender sensitivity and gender integration. In the broader framework of peacekeeping, at least we have so many reports, that so many findings and policies at national level and also at the global level. The HIPPO report was very substantive because from my assessment together with the global study, it actually released the findings based on number statistics, including the gaps. And then of course, most recently, the action of peacekeeping that had WPS as a core priority in the protection of civilian mandate, which started now to even bridge the gap, of course, in addition to other tools. Of importance for us, again, in this area was how then does this sensitivity apply for mission components and their respective functions. Commander Marcia has really ably took us through the whole option of the dynamics that plays with the different respective contingents in terms of the kind of training they get, the kind of briefings they get, the instructions they get through their SOPs, which all had a significant bearing and which all had to be well understood by trainers if at all those respective missions and respective personnel were going to be effective. And then lastly, you have to understand that the protection of the civilian mandate was, it's an all mission mandate. It cuts across all thematic issues. So the next thing is, how do we integrate gender sensitive in human rights, in elections. How does it mean in the words of protection? What does it mean in participation? Because in participation, which is the first pillar of 1325, it means participation at all levels of decision making, including any decision that is tied to their own protection. And that decision may also be tied to creating an environment that is enabling, that is secure, and actually protecting and preventing any form of threats. So they had to understand what is protection, how is it linked to protection of civilian? How does protection as a pillar and prevention as a pillar contribute to the broader POC mandate? And how does recovery within the context of sustaining peace, security, and stability, including development, how does it really build into the broad agenda? Let's move to the next, please. And then there are those challenges that we met. And I must admit that the challenges have been immense, and from the words and interactions from various peacekeepers, both men and women, one of the things was the complexity of the political and the security environment. It keeps on changing, it keeps on shifting. And here you are looking at asymmetrical warfare. You go to Somalia, you go to Mali, you go to DRC and South Sudan, very different conflicts, very different gender dynamics, very different culture. All this had a distinct bearing because, again, contingents are coming from very different orientations. Then you have the pushback on the WPS agenda and overall commitments on women. And when there is that pushback, it automatically translates and impacts on the POC, where women, children, girls are very much vulnerable. And then there's the whole issue of funding and also the whole lack of supporting the gender aspects in terms of deploying the right experts, deploying the personnel with the right skill, and also the whole conceptualization of victims, where the general assumption is that all women are victims and so all men are protectors. And then it may mean that because they are victims and they are protectors, we are only going to focus on the numbers, but we are not necessarily going to focus on integration per se, which also was a major challenge and still remains a challenge, because at the moment, most countries and contingents are focusing on numbers as opposed to appreciating the notion of integration and sensitivities that is cut across. Another major challenge is the culture and patriarchal system. It's not just a traditional aspect of it, but also at the institutional level, working with the disciplined forces, there are different cultural dynamics that are so inherent in how the systems are designed, how they are constructed, from the point of entry of service to the point of training to the time of deployment. There are deeply embedded cultures in different contingents that may also hinder this particular agenda of WPS and the whole aspect of gender sensitivity. And then the systemic failure to just invest resources, to collaborate with the local women, with the local grassroots networks that often bring a lot of expertise in terms of gender analysis, in terms of early warning information, in terms of gains, like had been explained earlier, when it comes to patrol, where do we patrol? Why do we prioritize on this area? Why do we engage these parties and not these other parties? Then the ways to improve gender insensitive capacities as part of forward-looking strategy. Basically, from a policy point of view, from at the very highest level, it's the language of the mandate, the language in the policies, all international and national, is very important. I already alluded to the kind of language that we are talking about. We are looking at operational effectiveness at this next level, where we are looking at the functions which are gender and data-driven for proper gender analysis with tools and indicators that are so much disaggregated along the lines of gender. Then you are also looking at improving capacities at the level of implementation and enforcement. And here we have to appreciate how does the different levels, human rights, IHL, accountability mechanisms, to what extent are they gender sensitive in terms of principle, in terms of purpose, in terms of implementation? And as we speak of it, we need not forget the whole notion of masculinity, because in the recent past, we have seen in some regions, masculinity is a huge issue, and there are elements that have often been overlooked in different mission areas. We have to consciously work towards addressing the barriers. I say consciously because it doesn't matter how well educated, exposed one is. It doesn't matter how much resources is, but the whole perception and attitude has a bearing on the kind of institutions member states will have. It has a bearing on how these personnel and how the commanders will behave. It has a bearing on how the peacekeepers, their kind of attitude towards the attitude of the host communities. And then we also have to appreciate that gender challenges are context specific, and each context will always offer unique needs and unique avenues. Even when we look at the caliber of gender advisor and technical expertise, we have to be alive to this particular reality. In my next, and I think which is my final slide, in terms of practical approaches to training, there are so many aspects. I think one of the challenges we saw that for most pre-deployment trainings, they may take 1 week to 2 weeks. When you look at how gender is integrated in one-off session of 45 to 90 minutes. It already tells you that that is an issue which has not been prioritized at all. There is also a second scenario where gender is integrated in all aspects at the very highest level to the very lowest level, which is a preferable approach. But I would say from experience, again, the most preferable, the best approach would be an integrated system, which is based on scenarios, because for peacekeepers, with so many other competing interests, there is a greater appreciation in what they can ably identify with, as opposed to the theories and the principles that many of us would want to really sensitize them on. But from a leadership point of view, especially at the very highest levels, you are looking at integrating gender at the management level, because the management is it dictates what happens at the command level. And it is here where we start to see accountability for gender. Then you go down, so you have the management, you have the planning, you have the support. All these are tied to data. So without data, there will be a problem. Then at the specialization course, which touches the system-wide approach to protection mandate, you are looking at the POC at the level of human rights, at the level of stabilization, which is specific to creating environment through security arrangements and structure. Then you tie it to humanitarian, you tie it to mission admin, because resources, budgeting, finance is linked there. And then there are the logistical elements. The last two are always a hindrance at the actual level. And then at the final stage, you have the what we call the foundational phase, which is the pre-deployment, which is now specific to the different civilians, to the different mission contingents, the peacekeepers and the police, and then to the senior mission leadership. If gender can be integrated in all these levels, we shall have had a win, I think, in the area of leadership and accountability. And then all these other processes can easily follow, and the results we want to see in POC can be ably achieved. Thank you. I hope I've been within my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aluak. I think particularly for highlighting the importance of culture for all individuals and institutions involved. I think that was really valuable. And for this point about the need to infuse trainings with practical scenarios rather than theory alone. Just a reminder again to our participants, we're hearing some really interesting and thought-provoking presentations. So please do feel free to submit your questions as we continue through the rest of the program. So thank you, Ruth. Now I'm also happy to introduce retired Lieutenant Colonel Musa Salmanu. Mr. Salmanu retired from the Nigerian Air Force in October 2017 after a career spanning over 2 decades. He served in various capacities within and outside the Nigerian military, including with the Economic Community of West African States, the UN, and recently the Irish Embassy. He now serves as a senior military advisor focusing on Nigeria with CIVIC, the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Mr. Salmanu will speak to his experience as a former military officer, a former peacekeeper, having participated in MONUSCO during 2010 to 2012, an instructor at various military institutions, including the Armed Forces Command and Staff College and a pre-deployment training center, and finally, as a POC subject matter expert. As a result of connectivity issues with Abuja, Mr. Salmanu will share his remarks with us via a pre-recorded video, but hopefully he will be available live during the Q&A session. I really want to thank him for his adaptability and for recording the presentation at the last moment today. And we really look forward to connecting with you directly during the discussion. So please, we'll continue with the presentation.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I want to specifically thank the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Rwanda, PAX, and Stimson Center for organizing this event and for having me. I work with Civic Nigeria program, and though I won't address, but I would like to highlight Civic's peacekeeping program has recently completed a comprehensive research on how UN peacekeeping operations can prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. This report is can be found on Civic's website. Now, I also want to join in the growing discussion on the link between protection of civilians, women, peace, and security, and the issue of institutionalizing gender perspective in training. First, I'd like to highlight that we have to, as practitioners or people engaged in women, peace, and security and protection of civilians, highlight that and link it up with operational effectiveness. What this means is that commanders must be made to see the strategic importance of incorporating or making the protection of civilians at the core of their activities, and to make them see them that instead of POC requirements being inhibitors, but that they are rather enhancers towards the attainment of the overall military objective. Commanders must be made to know that the overall objective of every military operation is to ensure effective protection of civilians, and that helps to attain or to achieve mission objectives. Then secondly, the issue of the fact that we need to learn and appreciate and also utilize the agency of women first through empowerment, but also through ensuring diversity that this brings to the table. Women, or the inclusion of women in the various or at the various levels of decision making when it comes to peace and security, must be seen as on the side of capability. Women bring a different perspective. They bring an added capacity and capability, and that helps in effectively attaining mission objectives and fulfilling that overall mission capacity or mission overall objectives. So women must be involved in very traditional peacekeeping, peace building, conflict resolution, not only as afterthought, but as main players, not only just also to tick the box, but because they have a unique capability that they bring to the table. For example, the issue of early warning is an area that women have shown to add that unique capability, not only when they are in security or within the security forces, but also in helping to connect security forces with the communities with whom they work. So that is unique in a way, and it helps to enhance effectiveness and ensures that commanders achieve their mission and the overall peacekeeper, either in peacekeeping or deployed in other missions. Thirdly, also, I want to highlight that peace and security, or women, peace and security, or protection of civilian wish list must be able and make deliberate effort to align with national aspiration and context. This is, if not done, risks being viewed as some kind of abstract value or kind of Western values, especially in this part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, where some of these things do exist and have proven that there are some kind of practices that encourage and reinforce this, but still are seen as alien or as new, and except that there is this deliberate effort to link them to national objectives or to link them to those talking particularly about peacekeeping contributing countries in a way that they see that it is in their own best interest and their security forces link up with the requirements of this, and that it helps to ensure that it kind of tallies with what their aspirations and the challenges that they are facing. At present, there is that thinking that women, peace and security or protection of civilians is purely a peacekeeping concept, or it's kind of a concept that is only aligned or useful during international armed conflict. Now, if you see that a lot of these countries are suffering with non-international armed conflict within their territories, so there is that need for us to link that and see how it is useful, and the fact that it's not only the utility is not only towards or during peacekeeping. Closely related to that is the national action plans must ensure that they are tailored with that concept at the back of the mind, tailored in a way that they meet national or local aspirations, and in a way that they are meaningful and thereby able to fit into the thinking, both politically, militarily, and in terms of security deliverables that these forces or day-to-day in their day-to-day interaction and actions with first their citizens and wherever they are deployed, later either in missions and when they come back. Fourthly, there's the need to, I think, develop a critical mass, develop and grow this critical mass, or a pool of competent and experienced personnel, which I feel must be both male and female. Very important that the male are brought on board and are made to understand the concept, the utility, and the need for women, peace, and security, not just as a concept, but as something that is needed and enhances mission accomplishment and enhances kind of overall protection, which is the general and basic objective of every military institution. Now, also, in one of the way that this could be done is also to not only encourage national forces or national armies to take up gender roles or to take up specific gender roles in their establishment, but to also expand them at various levels of the hierarchy or command. That way, when you have gender advisors, for example, or female engagement teams, whether it be they only female or hybrid, it helps to ensure that this is seen as something that can be useful at the national level, that could be useful to troops when they are in internal security operations or when they are fighting non-internationalized conflicts within their domains. Also, the fact that there's a need for us to increase the drive in recruitment, but very importantly, also retention of female officers. This could be done in a way that some of these postings or some of these roles are tweaked to ensure that women are encouraged to join, but to remain within the security forces up to a level that they attain positions of influence and serve as role model to those that are coming behind them. Lastly, I will want us to have at the back of our mind that and be prepared that we should be prepared for a kind of pushback from the traditional institutions that need to preserve the status quo. In this, I say that we must be open to engage. We must be open to see at that pushback. We must be open to ensure that we get a buy-in or advocate our positions or the positions of peace and women, peace and security and protection of civilians generally in a way that it encourages political buy-in, in a way that it encourages localization, in a way that it encourages both men and female advocating and accepting it as something that enhances operational capability and that enhances the attainment of the operational objective. This way, I think if we go by this, perhaps we could bring a kind of process whereby these are institutionalized and spread across, whether forces are deployed in peacekeeping operations or missions, or whether they are serving within their own countries on internal security operations or fighting non-international armed conflicts.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel Salmanu, for sharing these remarks. And I think especially for explaining so clearly the need for both men and women to work collectively to advance gender sensitivity in peacekeeping, and for warning us about the potential for pushback from the powers that be, among other really interesting points that you made. So we look forward to having you join us live during the Q&A as well. We will now round out our panel with a presentation by Dr. Georgina Holmes. Dr. Holmes joined the University of Reading in 2016 as a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow, and she is also a visiting research fellow at the National University of Rwanda. Dr. Holmes' research explores how female uniformed personnel are trained and socialized as peacekeepers by troop contributing countries, and examines the intended and unintended consequences these processes have on women's integration in UN and AU missions, focusing on South Sudan, Darfur, and Mali. Dr. Holmes is the co-founder and current chair of the BISA Peacekeeping and Peacebuilding Working Group, co-lead of the Gender and Peacekeeping Research Cluster of the West Africa Peace and Security Network, an academic advisor on women, peace, and security to the British Army, and an editor for the journal Genocide Studies and Prevention. Dr. Holmes, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Government of Rwanda and PAX and the Stimson Center for inviting me to take part in this very important and timely discussion. My research looks into how gender is integrated into pre-deployment training for tactical military peacekeepers. There's two elements to this that I look at. The first is how protection of civilians tasks are designed and delivered within the peacekeeping training space. And the second is how are women supported during the pre-deployment training to enable and facilitate their integration into peacekeeping workforces. I've been very fortunate enough to work with the Rwanda Defence Force, Ghana Armed Services, and the British Army, who've kindly given me access to observe their pre-deployment training over several years, and also to interview peacekeepers. And so far I've conducted 175 interviews with male and female peacekeepers of all ranks. Today, what I'm going to do is present some sort of top-line observations on how pre-deployment training programs are structured, and make some suggestions for improvement which could help facilitate gender-responsive, people-centered peacekeeping, focusing specifically on the protection of civilians mandate. The first thing to note with gender-responsive peacekeeping is that it cannot be achieved through training alone, because we need to see cultural change. And quite often training is regarded as a sort of magic bullet. And if you can quantify numbers of people that have gone through training, that means you're doing a good job and things are becoming gender mainstream. That's not the case. And as people have already talked about today, much of it is focused on changing the culture. So training needs to start at the cadet level, or green training as quite often known, and be integrated into military education at all levels and put into practice in the day-to-day operations of militaries as a step towards ensuring that peacekeeping itself also becomes gender sensitive. Pre-deployment training for peace operations shouldn't be the first place to introduce key concepts of gender mainstreaming and gender sensitivity, but at the same time, the pre-deployment training itself shouldn't be regarded as kind of revision of green training, which I've heard some trainers comment on and describe it as. This is obviously, as it has been identified, because peacekeeping operations bring different gender challenges and issues which peacekeepers need to prepare for. When pre-deployment training is the first time the peacekeepers are introduced to the theoretical concepts of gender equality and gender sensitivity, they often don't take it all in. They get very confused. There's a lot of disinterest, as I'm sure many trainers themselves have observed, and it's quite difficult to try and get complex theories across when you're teaching didactically in lecture style to anyone between 100 and 800 troops at one time. As people have identified, it's usually a very short space of time, maybe 45 minutes. And also it's taught in, for example, English rather than the TCC's official language. So this all compounds the confusion and disinterest. One female leader that I had spoken to did actually spend time trying to upskill her unit in the evenings during the training sessions in order to explain gender theory to them. But of course, not all leaders of units are going to do this extra work. And it does also place extra burden on perhaps women leaders who have a better understanding and desire for people to understand gender equality and gender sensitivity. The second observation which I want to make is that, and has also been mentioned by Ruth, is that currently there is too much emphasis placed on gender training as this singular standalone module which is taught in pre-deployment training. So gender sensitivity needs to be systematically mainstreamed through all the pre-deployment training and capacity building exercises, including modules on intelligence gathering and negotiation skills. And some TCCs are more progressive on this than others. So really focusing specifically on how gender sensitivity is being integrated into training for POC tasks. My third observation today is that we really need more time and resources to invest, and for those, we need more time and resources to be invested into developing practical training that helps tactical level military peacekeepers put the gender theory into practice. So what they've learned into the classroom needs to be really explored during scenario-based training. So one of the key reasons for this at a very basic level is that the kinds of people that join the military are not academic. They tend to be very practical focused. And when I've interviewed these peacekeepers from the 3 different TCCs, they've all said they prefer to learn through experience, collaboratively, learning from their colleagues' experiences as being the most beneficial. It is, of course, now for those TCs that are more interested in developing extensive pre-deployment training lasting between 6 and 8 weeks, it is quite common to have scenario-based training and role-playing in order to help peacekeepers understand the human terrain in the mission area and to work on the negotiation, the LA local leadership engagement skills, and also intelligence gathering, as well as protection of civilian tasks. However, a lot of these scenarios have been, in the past at least, shaped and designed and implemented by old school ex-military officers, usually men, for example, European and US consultants may be engaged, who aren't themselves necessarily gender sensitive. And you can also have situations where trainers have never themselves deployed to or peace operations. All of that impacts on how the training is designed and delivered. In scenarios, what tends to happen, again, because of a lack of resources, is that military personnel dress up and act as survivors of violence or local leaders, which can be offer a limited experience for the military peacekeepers, for the tactical peacekeepers, because they military personnel themselves, when they are acting as civilians, for example, can be quite predictable in their responses. So that kind of element of unpredictability isn't in the training. The second thing is that military personnel don't necessarily understand the human terrain of the specific mission that the troops will be deploying to, or possibly even what it would be like to experience conflict-related sexual violence. And a lot of the female peacekeepers in particular that I interviewed, who've said, who have had to deal with survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, have said it's been very, very different going to a mission and having to engage with women. My friend acting as someone who's been raped in the pre-deployment training, it's very much like theatre. It doesn't really feel like reality. So when my research conducted in Rwanda, Ghana and the UK has revealed that both tactical level female and male military peacekeepers need more pre-deployment training on how to support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And it really is a myth that women are inherently caring and nurturing and can naturally support women survivors. So female peacekeepers that have returned have said that really what they need is more specialist understanding training on the psychological impact that conflict-related sexual violence can have on individuals and communities. And they find that learning the process and the procedure doesn't quite get it. They need the soft skills required to manage those range of responses that survivors might experience over sustained periods of time. So in the training and even in scenario-based trainings, the process of engagement with a woman, for example, that's experienced conflict-related sexual violence might only last 20 minutes. But of course, in reality, that could last 3 to 4 hours before the NGO can get involved. The gendered needs of male survivors of conflict-related sexual violence are brushed over or ignored altogether, which again reinforces that stereotype of women only being victims. And similarly, as has been observed, local women in host communities are often depicted as victims and passive recipients of external intervention projects rather than as leaders. So this really points to the requirement to develop culturally sensitive as well as gender sensitive peacekeeping training that draws on the experiences of communities located in the mission area, including male and female survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, if that is possible, and local leaders, as well as the male and female peacekeepers themselves. So opportunities for enhancing gender sensitive training for peacekeepers in the future. I've recently viewed some of the training that's being given by the British Army for their deployment that will shortly be going out to Mali. And again, this points to a question of resource. They perhaps have a bit more resource to apply to their pre-deployment training. And what they have done, I think, is as a kind of good practice, is that trainers really focus on taking peacekeepers out of their comfort zone, throwing them curveballs to challenge their expectations about the gender dynamics within the local community. For many of the white British men, obviously there's an important element of trying to challenge their racial bias and understand and experience African leaders where they might not be so used to seeing Black men and women in power. What they've done to sort of do this, to achieve this, is to develop detailed storyboards and linked scenarios, ensuring that gender sensitivity is mainstreamed in intelligence gathering, protection of civilians, and counter-IED practices. And they use an external company who supplies both external consultants who've previously deployed to Mali, as well as role-playing actors to help design and deliver these scenarios. So one example could be that a local leadership engagement scenario with Tuareg leaders. The male white British trainee didn't realise that the final decision during the negotiation rested with the woman leader rather than her husband. So it was that shock element that helped him rethink his perception of the mission in Mali, or in that what will be that area within the Tuareg community within Mali. However, one kind of important thing to note is that in scenario-based training, trainees are often required to think about more than one activity at once. So they're required, I'll repeat that, the trainees are often required to think about more than one activity at once. So they'll have to think about intelligence gathering, troop or camp security, and the welfare of abused or, in one scenario, abused and trafficked women. It's much easier within the training environment for the trainers to focus on what they already know, which would be, for example, in this case, intelligence gathering and security with the Brits, leaving them to neglect the welfare of the trafficked women. And although what you need in that situation is to have trainers who can pick up on this afterwards and make that point and highlight that, rather than have trainers that will kind of engage in a tick box exercise and say the trainees have passed and the training because the response was adequate. So really, to conclude, there needs to be far more resource, money, and also time spent on focusing now on how you put the gender theory into practice during pre-deployment training. And I think you could extend that to in-mission training as well. And there's a real need to develop far more good practice, gather more good practice, and develop examples of situations. And with that, partnership working between TCCs, as well as partnership working between TCCs and militaries and police, whether that's a PCC or the police within the TCC itself, the police service within the TCC. I've noticed that quite often the training for police and also military can be quite siloed. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for these practical and really tangible contributions from your varied observations and expertise, Dr. Holmes. I think this actually provides a really great segue into our discussion. So thank you for your remarks. We will now open the floor to discussion. While you are busy typing in your question using the Q&A function, I'll remind you of a few key points about how we'll moderate the last 15 minutes of our session. Everyone is welcome to submit questions to our expert panelists. If you do, please include your name and a brief question or comment, as well as to whom your question is directed. I will start by posing a few questions that we received from participants in advance of the session to each member of our panel, though if time allows, we do want to invite a number of you to ask your question live, in which case we'll ask you to follow the instructions provided here on the screen. We only have about 15 minutes available, so hopefully we can get through as many of your questions as time and technology allow. And please also do remember that this is a public event that's being recorded and published. So I'll take advantage of my moderator's privilege to pose a few questions to start. I'll ask two questions directed at each member of our, two different members of our panel, and then give some time for them to respond. I'd like to first look back to Commander Braga. And we're wondering, in your experience, do you feel that you were expected to not just be a peacekeeper, but also specifically a female peacekeeper at times? For example, were you expected to perform an activity like engaging with women and children because of being a woman yourself? And if so, could you share your thoughts about the potential risks or benefits of peacekeeping forces playing these specific gendered roles? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it was very important. I think that the fact of being a woman, it was interesting because I had more access to local women. So, for example, I visited the Biral, and in Zambia battalion, they were deployed there. They had a female engagement team that actually it was a mixed team. But they had a special patrol called the Confidence Patrol that was composed only by women. And I visited a locality, and it was amazing because all the locals, not only women, but men and women, they were very confident to talk with us. So it was a moment that I really could talk with them and understand what was happening. And it's interesting to highlight that in this area, we had only one case of conflict-related sexual violence during a year. So it was an amazing number. So it shows the importance of this engagement. But I think that the fact that to be a woman, it helped in this engagement. Of course, that it was not. It's not a test only for women. It's for all peacekeepers to engage and to listen locals and to include the women and men in this dialogue. But the fact of being a woman, I think that really helped in this process of to understand the conflict, and the same way to receive the reports. It's something interesting because before my deployment, I had some resistance concerning the fact that I was a gender advisor, because sometimes we have a stereotype that's something only for women, and how to be seen like a soldier, not a woman first, but a soldier in this process, and how to do the job without this kind of stereotype for being a woman. But actually, it really helped in this job and mainly engagement and building trust. So my experience was very good in in this way. And of course, that I think that the best practice is mixed teams, is to have men and women working together. But women really helped in this building trust and in the report and receiving the process of receiving reports.
Thank you so much, Commander Marcia, for that, for those reflections. I really appreciate that. Ruth, I have a question for you as well. You have a really interesting background working with training institutions as well as regional and international organizations. A major issue is that troop and police contributing countries determine individually what gender-specific and POC-focused trainings will be. And further, different training institutions train in different ways, even if using the same UN materials and guidelines. How can we better link policies and pledges made in international and regional organizations with operationalization at the national level?
Thank you. There has been an attempt to link all these policy frameworks, the training and the standardization. But from where I sit, I think the greater responsibility is with the respective national governments, because the national governments have an upper hand on what goes in terms of training and what they will not have on board. And that often is informed by the resources at their disposal. So incrementally, and I think it's quite a challenge, because when we start to understand the history and the dynamics of the different countries and the kind of structures, the security structures we have, there is a huge variation. From a point of departure, I mean, I think it's more of just a deliberate political resolute that this is what is expected of us at the international level, and this is what we are going to have as part of our policy level. And then with that and having in place the right accountability mechanisms, it is an accountability that touches on the individual commanders and leaders, and also an accountability that goes to the different individuals at the lower level. At that level, gender and the WPS agenda becomes a priority of each and everyone involved in that space. Because I can tell you from my experience, anytime even you approach a training, there is always this quote in quote, let us hear what the women are coming to tell us today. And sometimes it comes from very high officials. Sometimes the notion of the very highest officials is what is really flawed. So for me, the investment has to be at the national level, and it has to be huge, deliberate resources in all aspects for us to be able to move and actually get to bridge that gap and divide that exists at the different tiers.
Thank you so much for your response, Ruth. I'm looking also to Musa, to Mr. Salmanu. I'm wondering if you have any additional remarks to share from your experience as well.
So thanks so much for the opportunity to add, if there are on remarks that I've already pre-recorded. What I'll just say is to perhaps agree with and perhaps highlight some of the suggestions or the presentations that have already been made, specifically in terms of changing behavior. I think it's the I think we take the whole issue of training and women, peace and security. Okay, can I?
Unfortunately, Musa, I think we're having some challenges in hearing you. Apologies to our participants for not being able to fully understand Musa's comments. But as I believe we mentioned already in the chat, we will be sharing a policy note, a policy brief with recommendations based on this session, and hopefully we can ask for Musa to contribute some additional points as well. I'd like to also pose one of the questions to the panel that came in from Jesse Bernstein from the US Department of State. He asks, peacekeepers are often hindered in responding to protect civilians for a whole range of reasons, whether these be logistics, government obstructions, poor roads, many other reasons. Yet civilians often expect peacekeepers to provide civilians with protection universally and blame them for violence or attacks. How can we address the level setting around expectations of who is actually responsible for providing protection? So thank you, Jesse, for posing that question. Maybe we can first look to Dr. Holmes for a response, and then if any of our other panelists would like to respond as well, please jump in after.
Could you just repeat that last sentence? Sorry, because I missed it. Sorry, with the oh, you're on mute.
Apologies. How can we address the level setting around expectations of who is actually responsible for providing protection?
Yeah, I think that obviously is a major challenge, because I think the key person that should be providing the key actors that should be providing this protection is the state. And so really, the focus should be on how the UN is supporting the state in providing that protection and stepping in to a gulf when that protection is required. And so again, and local communities also need to have the ownership of protection. So I think that always needs to be at the back of, the peacekeepers' mind, that they are supporting rather than actually and stepping into a void, as opposed to being the sole providers of protection.
Are any of our other panelists, does anyone have another quick response they'd like to share to the question?
Sure, maybe just a quick one. I think when we look at the protection mandate, especially under the doctrine responsibility to protect, it's three-tiered: the state, the host community, and the international community. Of course, we have the international, the state, but increasingly we also have the communities, so that in most missions today, in leveraging that expectation, we have to understand at the time at which missions are going in, especially within their operation procedures, the SOFAs and the SOMAs, who is going to do what, with which resources, with which actors, and how are peacekeepers coming in to support. So if that is laid up front, and if the mission and the host government also involves the communities, it becomes a shared responsibility. And that's why in the broader context of gender, you can actually not afford to exclude women or even to exclude men. It means that if we are talking of this particular protection of civilian, what is the value addition that these women are bringing on board in the context of early warning? And when we are looking at probably security arrangements or even reconstruction of those bridges or securing the spaces, what is their say? How do they envisage it? And how does the government own it? And how then does the peacekeepers support them in this? So from where I sit, it is a joint responsibility and it should be promoted as such.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I really appreciate that. We're unfortunately rapidly approaching the closing time. And so I'd like to round off the session by asking each panelist to just very briefly share in just a few seconds with us, just one main recommendation that you want us to take away from this discussion. And I'll go back in order and maybe start with Commander Braga.
So to finalize my presentation, first of all, I'd like to say thank you again for this opportunity. And as was highlighted here, I'd like to say that protection of civilians is a shared responsibility. It's a responsibility for all of us. We know that it remains in host countries and it's the first responsibility, but actually we have areas that have only the military there. and we can feel these expectations above us. So it's something that really demands the commitment of all of us. And talking about the action for peacekeeping, it's something that really must be emphasized. And as I told, it must have the commitment of all the involved actors, member states, TCCs, and emission, and it's something that it's really important, and prevention of violations, I think, is the way to better protecting civilians. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Could I hand it to you, Ruth, as well? Just one quick recommendation, please.
My recommendation?
I think in the interest of time, I'm sorry, Commander Braga, I'd like to ask each panelist for just one closing recommendation or takeaway. So I'd like to hand it to Ruth, please.
Thank you so much for this and for the.
Ruth, you're on mute, I apologize. Thank you.
My recommendation would be that if you're looking at gender sensitivity in peacekeeping operations in the context of POC, there has to be deliberate, conscious, systematized use and appreciation of data that can help us make concrete decisions, and by extension, concrete executions of the POC mandates.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Musa, if we have you for another quick recommendation or takeaway, please.
So thank you. So my quick recommendation would be that one, we need to create a critical mass. And this is an issue of behavioral change. It doesn't just happen by one pre-deployment training. It doesn't just happen by attending maybe one senior leadership or mission leadership or some kind of, it must be a conscious and deliberate step through highlighting to troop contributing or PCCs, police contributing countries, the strategic advantage that comes with protection of civilians, not only when they're deployed in peacekeeping missions, but also to their own, during operations, either other operations that could be operations other than war or even internal security operations, especially in countries within sub-Saharan Africa that have these challenges, but have been traditionally very big contributors to international peacekeeping across the globe.
Thank you very much, Musa. We appreciate that. And finally, very quickly to Georgina, one last point from you, and then we'll close the session.
Yeah, I would say we need to gather more good practice. We have so many TCCs that have been engaged in peace operations for many years now, and I think that this is a great opportunity to be able to really enhance the training by sharing good practice.
Thank you so much. That is unfortunately all the time that we have. I really want to thank our excellent speakers today, and also all of our participants for this really thoughtful discussion. We apologize that we did not have the time or opportunity to ask all of the questions that you posed, but we hope to be able to respond in our subsequent policy brief, or we'll aim to follow up individually as possible. So please do feel free to reach out with questions or feedback to us at poc@paxforpeace.nl, and visit the websites on the screen for more details about this and future events. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.